How did Kamala Harris lose this election by such a massive amount? Not just but a few days ago, it was forecasted to be virtually impossible for Donald Trump to win the popular vote. But now that the election is over, not only did he win the Electoral College, but he won the popular vote as well. How did this happen? Well, I don't have a degree in political science, I have a degree in finance. So we're going to analyze some key areas where I think the Harris campaign fumbled massively from the standpoint of a business. Because at the end of the day, a campaign is just a business. So without further ado, as always, my name is Derek and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. This is not a political endorsement for either side. We are simply breaking this down from a business perspective. So let's get started. Now, some of these are more severe in my opinion than others. So let's go over these in no particular order. The first area where I think the Harris campaign messed up is when it comes to the voter base. We can kind of call the voter base customers, right? Because a business has to sell to customers and a campaign has to convince voters to vote for them. So when it comes to this, we can apply some basic business principles. There are a couple of main ways that you can acquire a customer. One of those is known as casting a wide net. This is appealing to as many people as possible. Another way is to niche down. So a good example of either would be niching down would be something like, say, hiking shoes. That appeals to a very specific group, hikers. And you could even have a niche within a niche. You could have shoes for mountain climbing. That is within the hiking niche, but even more niche down. The second option would be to throw a wide net. This is done by companies, say, like the people who make paper towels, or the people who make basic essentials, or the companies that make cell phones. These are things that many people need. Some of them are essential, some of them are luxury, but a large swath of the population needs them. I think where Harris and the campaign that she ran messed up was basically pandering to too small of an audience. Yes, rights are important across the board, but when it comes to convincing a large swath of the United States to vote, it means that not only do you need the popular vote, but you need many different states and many different electoral votes from all these different states to win the presidency. So when you pander to too small of a group, you are outcasting the rest. And in this country, there is a huge swath of voters that are white males. And at the end of the day, one of the major ways that I think the campaign for Harris messed up was not focusing enough on this group of people. Yes, they probably care about them, but in their campaign, all the debates and all the ads, they needed to target these people more because when it comes to running a campaign, it is more about casting a wide net, not niching down. Another area where I think the Harris campaign messed up to a high degree was her not distancing herself enough from Biden. In most people's minds, Harris and Biden, for all intents and purposes, were the same ticket, which means that Harris would mean another 4 years of Biden. If you look at the average American and you ask the average American about their issues over the last 4 years and whether their life is better now or not, a lot of those people will say that it is not. And yes, trust me, I'm a numbers guy, I'm a data guy, I love numbers and I love statistics, but at the end of the day, when it comes to elections, it is perspective that matters. And what I'm going to use, I guess, as an example are a couple of things. One is a CEO replacement. When a company is not doing well and they bring in a new CEO, a lot of the times that new CEO has radical ideas, has very different ideas, or comes from a different company where he or she has turned them around positively. Sometimes companies pull from within their own ranks, but a lot of times they do not, because pulling from within your own ranks a lot of the time means more of the same. And if a company is going downhill and the ship is sinking, you probably want somebody fresh to fix it. So for most Americans, I think one of the major issues for the Harris campaign was that she was the vice president. I think that the Democrats in the Harris campaign thought that this would be a positive, but when you look at the overall sentiment to the last 4 years, whether it's true or not, when you look at the overall sentiment, a lot of people feel like their life is not better, especially when it comes to the economy, and I am foreshadowing. Now, before we get to the economy and inflation, which foreshadowing, I think are probably two of the major issues that caused voters to sway in the other direction. Before we get there, we have a couple more things that we have to talk about. One is that Harris simply was not the right candidate for the job. In a lot of Americans' minds, she comes from California, which is a very, very liberal state. On top of that, she is a prosecutor, a former prosecutor, and she is extremely well polished. Now, to some people, that might sound like a good thing, but unfortunately, to a large swath of Americans, it sounds too bureaucratic. And one of the key ideals for Trump is that he is not a lifelong bureaucrat. He is not a lifelong in the system member of politics or the law. So when the Democrats, and this is more so an issue with the Democrats, when they're picking a front runner for their campaign, they have to understand what is working in the United States. And again, a lot of the times these elections come down to undecided voters and riling up their voter base. The people who were gonna vote for Harris would most likely vote for any Republican, any Democrat. But the people who were gonna vote for Trump, that doesn't mean that they were going to vote for any Republican. That's why Trump was the front runner. He activates a powerful base of untapped voters. On the Democrat side, they needed to find someone that was going to activate a base in a similar way. And when you look at these undecided voters, the ones that can sway it in either direction, the reason they're undecided is probably because something about Trump pulls them in that direction. Yes, maybe it's his policies, but perhaps it's also how he carries himself. And you or I might say that's great or that's horrible. But the undecided voter likes probably to some degree that he is not a bureaucrat and that he is strong and he is loud and he's not afraid to say what's on his mind. So I think the Harris campaign, or more so the Democrats, would have had a much easier job. Maybe they still would have lost, but they maybe would have had a much easier job if they would have picked a better candidate. And following that up, right before we talk about the economy and inflation, which in my opinion were the two major ones, we have one more thing to talk about, and that is Harris not being loud enough. And when I say loud, I mean bold, and I mean not afraid to offend. In my opinion, the Harris campaign either A, would have done better with her being able to go up there and be loud and push back, almost bully back Trump, just like Trump does to her, as opposed to being this polished individual. Or B, the Democrats should have picked a candidate that was able to do that. And I genuinely mean they needed a candidate who could have gone up there on stage, whether it be for a debate, whether it be for a speech, and genuinely just told Trump to go f*** himself, to shut the f*** up, or to eat shit, basically. Because we live in this extremely polarized political climate, and for many, many years, we've had bureaucrat after bureaucrat after bureaucrat come in and run the country. And for whatever reason, people do not trust that. So if the Democrats could have put in a candidate that could have gone up there and said, you know what, no, f*** that, that's bullshit. I think your ideas are crazy, you're insane. Or if Harris could have embodied some of that, again, I'm not saying that she would have won, but in this case, it's kind of like fighting fire with fire. And for the business perspective when it comes to this, basically, the way that I would say it is to start looking at all the ads on social media as well as the accounts for companies on social media. A couple good ones that come to mind is like Ryanair. If you ever look at Ryanair's, which is an airline, if you look at their social media account, it's crazy. It's literally crazy. They talk back to customers. They make fun of customers who maybe have wrong grievances. It's crazy. And then another good example is like Nutter Butter, the cookies or crackers. Have you seen their social media? It is unhinged. And that is because some companies, quicker than others, are realizing that we're in this politically charged climate and this political correctness versus, being canceled, and they're actually running with it because it is such a breath of fresh air in this climate. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but in this climate, it is a breath of fresh air. So the Harris campaign or the Democrats most likely would have done better if they picked a candidate that could have gone up there and maybe even dropped a couple of F-bombs, literally, and pushed back on Trump's rhetoric. Okay, and now the two most important ones. These are two separate issues, but we're going to talk about them as one because they relate. And that is the economy and inflation. When it comes to voting, there's a very good saying, and it says people vote with their wallets. Nothing could be more true. At the end of the day, regardless of how people feel on civil rights, on social rights, on women's rights, on colored rights, on all of those things, before anything else, people care about how they are. And when people's well-being is gauged, it's usually gauged in an economic sense. So, the one key issue that I truly think solidified the win for Trump was the economy. Now, we can go over the statistics all day long, and here's the problem. Democrats did go over the statistics. They kept touting how fantastic the numbers were, right? Unemployment, inflation is coming down. The problem is for the average person, it might not feel like that, mostly because of inflation. This is where we start to make the transition. Most people feel like the economy was not in a great place, especially when compared to 2016 to 2020. When people say the economy, in my opinion, most people mean inflation, because prices are significantly higher now than they were in 2020 and significantly even more higher now than they were in 2016. We can argue all day whose fault that is. Is it the president's? Is it the Federal Reserve? Is it Trump's fault? Is it Biden's fault? But to the average voter, inflation is higher under Biden, it's Biden's fault. Now, to you or I, if you're watching this video, you probably have some understanding of finance. I very much understand that the president and inflation pretty much don't really have much to do with each other. Inflation mostly is caused by the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. If monetary policy is easier, that means there's more money in the market, well, inflation is more likely to increase. There's also price inflation, which is different. It is a symptom of monetary inflation most of the time, which means prices rise, but it can also happen because of supply chain issues. I understand this, and I understand that a lot of the times the Federal Reserve is more to be looked at when it comes to these things. But the Harris campaign did a horrible job, not only distancing themselves from Biden when it comes to the economy, but explaining to people that the president and inflation do not go hand in hand. A lot of times they have nothing to do with each other, and a lot of the times the president has virtually no power directly over inflation. So this, again, to relate it to business, this would be what's known as an education campaign. You have to first educate your customers, in this case your voters, before getting them to purchase your product, in this case to vote for you. I rarely saw Harris, in debates or speeches or ads, educate people as to how inflation works. And what's scary to me is I'm not even sure if she understands how inflation works. But in order to run an effective campaign, I think this was the largest issue that caused people to vote for Trump instead of Harris, is that they relate Harris to Biden and Biden to inflation. And a simple, massive ad campaign simply stating, hey, I know inflation is high. That's another thing. Admitting that inflation is high and that prices are higher. Saying, hey, I understand that inflation has been high for the last 4 years. The reason for this is not Biden. And it's definitely not me because I wasn't even president. The reason for inflation is yada, yada, yada. The Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates to try to, has raised interest rates to try to combat that inflation. That inflation comes from the quantitative easing in monetary policy that took place in 2020 and 2021. The supply chain issues also caused inflation. That is because of this huge pandemic. And you could even word it in a way where it's like, hey, Trump made that worse because he didn't promote masks soon enough. He didn't shut down the economy soon enough. If he would have done it sooner, we would have done it for a shorter amount of time. Whatever. You could have spun it in a way that educates people as well as putting you as the better candidate. I never once or rarely did I see that from the Harris campaign. And when people vote, they vote with their money. If people do not have money, they do not care about other issues as much because people care about their own well-being. They want to be able to support their family and their children. And the only way to do that is if they earn a living wage, and that living wage is rising quick enough to counter inflation. And when you ask the average person on the street, that's just not the case, regardless of what the data says. And when it comes to elections, perception is more important than reality. And right now, for a lot of voters, the perception is that the economy is bad, and it got bad under Biden. There you have it. I think those are 6 areas where the Harris campaign and Democrats in general fumbled massively. And whether they would have won the election or not, if they would have changed these things, I don't know. But they probably would have done better. If you like personal finance, world economics, and investing, you are in the right place. This is not a political channel. This is not a political endorsement, one direction or the other. I try to stay out of politics because that's not where my expertise is. My expertise is in finance, and I want to help you with your money and investing and learning about personal finance, regardless of who you voted for. So if that's something you're interested in, you are in the right place, and I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, take care.